Bill, we've spoken about this coalition of the willing, which is, of course, members of the EU, the UK, pretty much run by France, by Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron, where they want to keep funneling money and aid into Ukraine so that they can continue fighting this war. But of course, mostly to be able to give them that security and protection of boots on the ground once the ceasefire is done. I mean, they were basically just following on from what Donald Trump had been saying, that the EU needs to step up. So for Steve Witkoff to say in this interview, he said, on the coalition of the willing, he said, I think it's a combination of a posture and a pose, and a combination of also being simplistic. There is this sort of notion that we all have to got to be like Winston Churchill. Russians are going to march across Europe. That it's preposterous, by the way. We have something called NATO, and we did not have that in World War II. Now, to throw NATO in the mix, to say we've got NATO, so there is no point for the coalition of the willing, is kind of contradictory, because the United States has basically backed away from NATO. They haven't included NATO in a number of these early negotiations, and they urged the EU and the UK to step up. So I'm kind of concerned and confused as to what this would mean to say, well, the coalition of the willing is a posture and a pose. What was your response when you read that news yesterday or today?
Well, it's completely disingenuous. Pete Hegseth, the U.S. Defence Secretary, basically said that if there is a peace negotiation and there's a peace treaty, then Europe would have to put people on the ground. And I think that and went on to say America wouldn't put people on the ground. And of course, we've also heard Donald Trump say very clearly that he's not happy with NATO, and he may not come in to protect NATO allies. And so, it's all very strange mixed messages. Maybe he didn't know what he was talking about. Maybe it's hard to even imagine, like, is there anyone who's like sitting there sort of coordinating the party line? I don't think so. It's just guys spitballing, freewheeling, saying whatever they feel like saying. And some of it contradicts the other people, and this is the chaos of the Trump presidency.
Mike Waltz, Trump's national security advisor, Bill, he was asked whether the US would accept a peace deal with Russia if it meant that Russia got to keep that 20% of occupied Ukrainian land. He replied that he basically said, we have to ask ourselves, is it in our national interest? Is it realistic? Are we going to drive every Russian off of every inch of Ukrainian soil? Now, this is one of the big parts of this peace deal, because Zelensky's obviously not going to accept a deal where he has to give off 20% of his land. And it seems as if Putin won't give up that 20% of land. So how does a deal get done when it comes to this? And it's just so frustrating, because if Trump gets so frustrated with a deal not being done, I feel like he might just take a side. And it might be with Russia, where he said the only way we can get a deal done is basically we're going to have to give up this land. Sorry, Zelensky. Sorry, Ukraine. Is that your understanding of what might happen in that situation when it comes to that 20% of land?
Well, first of all, I don't think a deal is going to get done. I don't think there's any chance that a deal gets done. I think that we'll be here a year from now having a conversation about the war between Russia and Ukraine. I don't think that there's any chance that Putin. The important thing to understand is that Putin hasn't altered his maximalist objectives. He doesn't want just 20% of the land. He wants everything. He doesn't want any peacekeepers of any nationality on Ukrainian soil. He doesn't want Ukraine to continue to have a military. And he's stated all these things. He laid them out perfectly clearly from the beginning of the war, and his position hasn't altered by an inch. And so to think that he would be happy if he just got 20% of the land and that would be the end of the war, that's not going to happen. That's just so far away from his own expectations. And so whether Zelensky would or wouldn't give up 20% of the land is kind of irrelevant. What Putin wants is everything. And so Putin is not going to get everything he wants. And the Ukrainians aren't going to surrender. And the Europeans aren't going to allow Russia to occupy Ukraine to then carry on pushing towards Europe, which is what Putin intends to do. And therefore, the war is not going to be over. That's just as simple as that.
Is the only way that you see the war being over, Bill, is by the US, by the EU, by the UK, giving more military aid to Ukraine, giving them more support so that they can win this war on their own. They can push Russia out.
Well, the basic thing is that Putin has invaded Ukraine. Ukraine is defending themselves. Putin, at any moment in time, if he wanted to, can end this war by stopping the invasion. He could stop. He could just be done with it. It's completely and solely within his power and his discretion to do that. He doesn't want to stop it. And so the only way to stop this war is to put him in a position where he has to stop it. And the only way that that can happen is with military force. And as much as everybody says this war is terrible and we don't like war, of course we don't like war. But Putin's the one who's doing the war. It's not, the Ukrainians are just defending themselves. And as far as the Ukrainians are concerned, they understand what happens when Russia occupies their country. And we've seen absolutely clear images of that in Bucha. You remember Bucha? This was where Russia occupied a town outside of Kiev. And when the dust had settled and they had been expelled from Bucha, we got to see what happened there. And what happened there was the women were systematically gang raped. The men were tied up, tortured, and then shot and buried in shallow graves. And the children were kidnapped. That's what Ukraine has to look forward to if they surrender. And therefore, no matter how tired they are of war, they would rather fight a war than face that unbelievable, hellish prospect of the women being raped, the men killed, and the children kidnapped.
So it is important that every NATO country, Bill, continues to supporting Ukraine as opposed to giving up these insane concessions that Russians are asking from them, or these insane conditions that just seem like a time filler of pushing the US around. And it's kind of strange to me that Donald Trump is continuing to believe that Putin is negotiating when really I think he's just playing with his head.
Yeah, what you have here is not a negotiation about the war. This is a series of meetings to normalize relations between Putin and the United States, and I think Putin is being very successful at it. And we're all sort of sitting here watching a sort of reality TV show where the reality is that Putin is coming in from the cold, and he's going to get all sorts of unbelievable gifts for doing nothing other than carrying on his murderous genocidal invasion of Ukraine.
We'll be waiting for those discussions today, Bill, to see if they reach real progress, to say that Steve Witkoff says. So thank you for joining the Trump Report today.
Thank you.